Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Roald Dahl Retrospective, where we take a look at adaptations based off of Roald Dahl's books and shorts. I am Patricia.
And my name is Arun.
So today we are going to be discussing about the 2015 BBC movie Roald Dahl's Esio Trot, based off of the 1990 book of the same name.
Yeah, one thing I want to start off with this is that, Patricia, that we know Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, we know Fantastic Mr. Fox, but as far as I'm aware, no one kind of really talks about this movie except for when we've kind of brought it up today.
Yeah, I guess there's many reasons why. Let's start off with the book itself. So, the only reason why people would know about the book was that this was the very last book that was published while Roald Dahl was still alive. Looking into the books that came out posthumously, as in like the books that came out after his death, were received much better because they were more in line with his whimsical, over exaggerative, creative presentation. While as Esio Trot is definitely a lot more grounded. There's nothing magical about it. There's nothing whimsical. There's no powers. There's no creatures. So, yeah, it's a shame that pretty much when it comes to Roald Dahl books, nobody talks about Esio Trot. Now, when it comes to the adaptation, once again, this is a BBC production, so it was only released in the UK. The only way that we Americans were able to get it was through the distribution of the Weinstein Company. And yes, that's right, Harvey Weinstein and his brother were executive producers of this, and they were the ones responsible for the distribution. And because of that, I take it that pretty much most people didn't even know about it. So, yeah. But
to be fair, though, I think we could probably. I mean, they were only in charge of making sure that the film got to A to B. I mean, they didn't actually have a say in how the production actually went. So the BBC actually kind of took the lead on that.
Yeah, exactly. They were just in charge of the distribution, unlike in Four Rooms, in which they were heavily involved with the production, and you can definitely tell. But yeah, they were just involved with there's this movie that is from another country. We're just going to distribute it for people to watch.
Yeah.
And
it's kind of like the deal that Disney had with Studio Ghibli when they started distributing their movies and saying that, hey, we're going to bring out all their stuff, and basically we're going to start doing all the remastering and the dubs and things like that, So that was it's kind of like that kind of deal, if you will. So.
Exactly, yeah. But did this movie deserve to be more properly recognized, or was it a good reason why pretty much not a lot of people talk about it? We have talked about our fair share of obscure Roald Dahl adaptations, and for the most part, there was a reason why they were obscure. But yeah, let's get started. Here we go.
Give me a kiss to build a dream on, and my imagination will thrive upon that kiss. Sweetheart, I ask no more than this, a kiss to build a dream on.
The one thing I wanted to kind of bring up is that I'm really surprised that at this time, British movies, at least British media, were starting to get into the attention of the American public. Downton Abbey's been a massive success, I think, for a lot of American audiences. So I'm just very surprised that something like Esio Trot, which has James Corden in it, who's now a big celebrity in America now, it's funny that this fell under the radar of some people.
Yeah, and not only that, but huge celebrities were featured, such as Dustin Hoffman and Judi Dench. Those are names that you don't just throw out. Those are huge names that you can put top billed in your movie. But unfortunately, yeah, pretty much nobody really knows about this BBC TV movie. So this movie came out around, I believe it was around Christmas of 2015, which I've noticed that, especially with the BBC, they do tend to release certain movies around the Christmas or the New Year's Eve holiday. So yeah, this is no exception, and yeah, it has Dustin Hoffman as Mr. Hoppy, and it has Judi Dench as Mrs. Silver, and the story plays off very similar to the book, in which Mr. Hoppy is a very shy man who lives in an apartment by himself and who takes care of his flowers, and he falls in love with a woman by the name of Mrs. Silver, and he is just so infatuated with her. He wants to talk to her, he wants to be able to get to know her, but he's just really shy and doesn't know what to say. Well, Mrs. Silver is the complete opposite. She's very outgoing, she's very talkative and optimistic, and she finds Mr. Hoppy to be very sweet and charming, but nothing really too in depth with how she personally feels about him, because she's like that with everybody. She has a tortoise that she absolutely loves, and she takes care of it, and she makes sure that it gets its proper food and its proper love and all that kind of stuff. And she wants the tortoise to be able to grow up, because it's a very, very small tortoise. So this gives the opportunity for Mr. Hoppy to maybe get closer to Mrs. Silver by essentially telling a lie that he knows some African chant that would be able to make the tortoise grow up.
Yeah, it makes me kind of wonder, like, if that was I don't want to say like a derogative thing. I think against South Africans, because there have been many people who comment to me about people they meet from South America, and it's kind of like it's from South Africa. I do apologize, and they say that they kind of sound like their language is kind of a bit backwards, like the way that it kind of like it's accented. I hope it's not a play on that, because I think we've had enough. I think discrimination from Roald Dahl, for enough for one retrospective. But in the regards to doing this whole thing, I mean, it's not very creative. I think I would say that Mr. Hoppy uses to get the attention of Mrs. Silver, because all he's really doing is just kind of writing stuff backwards.
So essentially, he gives her like this poem that says Esio Trot, Teg Regib, Emok no Esio Trop, Warg Poo, Foob Poo, Toots Poo, Gnurps Poo, Wol Boo. It's essentially everything is in backwards. It's a tortoise, get bigger, come on, tortoise, grow up, puff up, shoot up, spring up, blow up, swell up. So it's essentially that. So he decides that he's going to give it to her, and he tells her, I want you to say these 3 times a day, and I promise that your tortoise, Alfie, will be able to grow up, and he'll be able to become the size that you want him to be. And over the course of the movie, we do get to see Mr. Hoppy going over to many pet shops and buying hundreds of different tortoises of shapes and sizes. And I have to say that in this particular movie, the pet store owner is a riot. He is amazing. He's just like so crazy and over the top. And he tries to convince him to like buy these animals that are clearly illegal, that you shouldn't have in a pet store, like an elephant or a giant spider or anything like that. But yeah, that pet store owner is just awesome. He's played by Jimmy Akingbola. He did a fantastic job. And another person who did a really fantastic job was Richard Cordery as Mr. Pringle, who is not in the original book, mind you. The only people who are major characters in the book were Mrs. Silver and Mr. Hoppy. I mean, there are like big characters here and there, but for the most part, those are the characters that we focus on. But in this movie, we have the narrator, who's played by James Corden, and I have to say that out of all the narrators that we've seen in this retrospective, like the narrator from Roald Dahl's Little Red Riding Hood, James and the Giant Peach, Matilda, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, I have to say this is the best narrator that we've seen so far.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, like, it's James Corden. I mean,
I'm not talking about, like, sure, of course, it's James Corden, but I'm talking about, like, this narrator makes so much sense in the story. In Roald Dahl's Little Red Riding Hood, he was a nothing character. And then we had Danny DeVito as playing as Matilda's father, and then coinciding with the narrator, which didn't really make that much sense. And then there was Pete Postlethwaite as both the mysterious guy who gave James the crocodile tongues, and then as the narrator. He didn't really play that much into the story. And then there was the Oompa Loompa who did the narration for Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which again didn't really have that much significance in the plot. But this narrator does, and it's so clever of how they reveal it. So he's just some random guy who keeps telling the story about Mr. Hoppy, and you're wondering, who is this guy? How does he know everything? And the twist comes in a lot later, and it's so clever that you just can't believe it when you first see it.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to say, Patricia, that the fact that you've spent the last 4 or 5 minutes pretty much speaking, I've just been listening, I get the feeling you like this movie.
I do, actually. Here's the thing, like, I have to say that out of all the Roald Dahl adaptations, this is hands down the most underrated. I'm just absolutely shocked that this movie is not talked about very often, because when it comes to like your Roald Dahl adaptations that is pretty much beloved, everybody says the same thing. Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, James and the Giant Peach, Matilda, Fantastic Mr. Fox, but nobody brings up this, and it's right up there with some of the best movies that we've seen throughout this retrospective.
Well, you got to keep this in mind, Patricia. I mean, the BBC is not a one-trick pony. It's a massive corporation, and they pump out tons and tons and tons and tons of media pretty much on an annual basis. So, I mean, to me, it wouldn't be too surprised that something like Esio Trot might potentially get lost in the shuffle, because I mean, like, who's gonna want to, get to grips with that in America when they've realized that Matt LeBlanc's gonna be doing the next Top Gear? At the time.
Yeah,
so,
fair enough.
I think when it comes to, I think the Americans' perception of the BBC is that, and I get Dustin Hoffman's in this and everything like that, but I just think that in regards to what Americans, I think, expect out of the BBC, I think it's the cars, I think it's the news, and I think it's various other things, and I think something like Esio Trot, I think, in a way is a bit niche. I think, in a way, because obviously you and I are going to love it because obviously it's Roald Dahl. I mean, and also, yeah, I'm going to like it because it's the BBC and it's kind of like what I've been brought up with since the age of 5. So I think for people like yourself and people like me, I mean, we're going to have an appreciation for it. But I think for the general viewing public, I think it's going to be something that they still, on top of that as well, it has this kind of English-British charm to it as well, which I think doesn't always resonate with American audiences. Like you see what I mean. Obviously it's a bit of a bad example, but M. Night Shyamalan tried to emulate that feel with of like a European style of storytelling, and try to bring in what he thinks is going to win him a BAFTA rather than win him an Oscar, if you know what I mean. So I mean, and that doesn't always resonate well, and when it's translated poorly, then obviously it turns into a disaster. I mean, look at The Last Airbender, for crying out loud. But it's so I think in regards to in people's tastes in regards to movies, I think if it's with Esio Trot, I think it sort of suffers from having a bit of too much of a British-centric charm to it, I think, for American audiences, I think, to kind of get an appreciation for sometimes.
And also, just like I mentioned earlier, is that when you think of Roald Dahl, you think of the magic, you think of the whimsy, you think of the supernatural, you think of creatures and monsters and magic. None of that is in Esio Trot. It's much more grounded and down to earth.
But doesn't it speak to Roald Dahl's talent, in regards to this? Like, the fact that he doesn't have to go to fantasy in order to, he doesn't have to go, create a whole massive chocolate factory out of fantasy and whimsical or anything like that. He can just take a situation, of an elderly couple who are, sparks are flying at the minute, and he's going to build a story around that, and he can still, bring in some sort of realism to it, if you will, and he doesn't have to reach out to magic, right out of the get-go. He can basically just do oh hey, here's Mr. Hoppy just playing a kind of a very creative trick on for Mrs. Silverman to get her to see that her turtle is growing, and he's basically swapping and changing out turtles the entire time.
Yeah, exactly. So throughout the movie, we have Mr. Hoppy, switching in turtles gradually to make sure that Mrs. Silver is not too overwhelmed with the fact that her turtle is like, goes from small to huge overnight, which is completely unrealistic, and the narrator actually pointed it out in this hilarious scene in which, like, let's just say that a little boy is taking his puppy with him to school, and then he leaves for the day. And then when he comes back after school, the dog is gigantic and he's barking at him, and then the boy runs away crying and screaming. That's hilarious. There's a lot of hilarious moments in this movie, especially when it comes with the narrator. I mean, it's James Corden, what to expect, but he's able to like lure in the audience. Like, oh man, even though that this is a very simple story about these two people who fall in love, James Corden's narration is able to like lure you in as like, oh man, what's going to happen next? And then along the way, he picks up his daughter from school, and then they're talking about the story of Mr. Hoppy and Mrs. Silver, and then we get to see it play out. Over the course of the movie, we do get to see Mr. Pringle, and he wants to be invited over to Mr. Hoppy's house for dinner, and he's such a glutton, which of course he is. I mean, like, let's be honest. I mean, this is a typical Roald Dahl trope. Even though he was never in the book, the elements of it is there. I mean, he's just the fat guy for the sake of just being the fat guy. Although, however, he does actually have a really, really funny personality, and he's pretty cruel. The fact that he like sneaks in, his like Mr. Hoppy's food while he's not looking and eating it. And then he's just constantly telling his backstory and not listening to anybody else's. So he's pretty selfish.
Yeah, but I mean, like, in regards to, like, I mean, here's the thing about this. In regards to Roald Dahl villains, I mean, they've always been kind of like, a one-dimensional kind of thing, really. Look at all the kids that, entered the chocolate factory, pretty much. I mean, he's kind of cruel to kind of call them villains, although I would say they're kind of victims of their antagonists in their way. But, I mean, like, Roald Dahl, in regards to that, I mean, he never really was in the business of making complex characters out of his out of people who were opposing our protagonist, if you will.
That's very true. Yeah.
So I mean, I thought like he was I think the imagination came from the people, the imposing threats. I think the imagination came from the world around it. That's one of the great things about it, is that I would say that he can definitely be forgiven for the in-depth of the characters. It was more about the world that he created, and I think that's what unfortunately we lack in modern storytelling now. I think a lot of stories that we see now are more character driven rather than kind of like appreciating the world around them, if you will. And,
that's true. Yeah.
I mean, you look at Marvel, and you look at like Stan Lee and things like that. You look at the way that he created. I mean, he also created complex characters, no doubt about that. Like his comics basically like Russian novels in some places. But I mean, you also as well like the city of New York is a very fantastic place in itself, and it's a great place for Spider-Man, and vice versa, other places as well. So like that's one of the great things about it. If you're not going to put too much strength into your characters, at least you still got a world to play with, and that's what Roald Dahl did.
Yeah, he was very well known for world building. If you look at the world, it is so rich and deep. Like the world of the chocolate factory, and you have the suburban life of the characters from The Witches or Matilda, and also with the BFG, in which the giants, they have their own language, and each and every single one of them have their own distinct personalities. And if you look at the characters, they're very simple. And yes, I mean, you would say that they're kind of one note, but they're supposed to be relatable for the children. That's why throughout this entire retrospective, I've been pointing out over and over again about how if you look at the bare basics of characters such as Charlie, Luke, James, Sophie, they're pretty much the same character, the timid yet optimistic character. Matilda's a little bit different, in which she's very intelligent and she is very witty and she doesn't take any crap from her parents. And, with like, Mr. Fox from Fantastic Mr. Fox, in which he's very clever and witty as well. And same thing with Danny's father from Danny the Champion of the World. So, yeah, they play around, the very same cliches and tropes, but it's but what makes it really good and what makes it still remembered by many people to this day is that not only are they very easy to understand and very relatable, but also the world that they're in is very inviting, that you wish that you were there, which is why Roald Dahl's books are beloved by many generations.
Which makes the setting of our movie actually pretty good, because if you're looking for a well-versed place with a lot of things to look at and a lot of interest to be found, where else could you place it but except in London? Which I think is a great place to put it for a movie. I think, the one thing about this is, like, it does feel like a Roald Dahl movie, because you look at all the characters and how simple they are, and you look at the immense world that they currently live in, and that as well, and how, imaginative it all is, and how real it all is too. Like, it's obviously, it's a grounded movie, so obviously it's going to have a lot of realism in it. But I just feel like, when you're watching this movie, you feel like Roald Dahl is writing this. When you're seeing it. And yeah, they do take some creative liberties, which we'll get later on, but don't you feel like, out of all the Roald Dahl movies that we've seen, yes, we've seen some fantastic things, but, in Esio Trot, like, goddamn, like, we're in a world that does feel like this is what Roald Dahl put on paper.
Yeah, exactly. Like, this is something that would be in the imagination of Roald Dahl, about, like, this is what his life would have been, which, according to the book, which had, like, a little excerpt in the end, was that he was heavily inspired by his garden, where it had tortoises, and his family would be feeding them. So, his garden was full of tortoises, and, he was heavily related to, his time in South Africa during the war, in which also had its fair share of tortoises. So, yeah, I mean, it did play a lot into his real life as well, which, is very similar to a lot of his books that we've talked about during this retrospective. I think another thing that we need to mention about this is that one of the co-writers of this movie was Richard Curtis. Now, Richard Curtis, you may know as a person who has written many TV shows and movies. He was the co-writer for Four Weddings and a Funeral, Bridget Jones' Diary, Love Actually, Blackadder, Mr. Bean. Like, his writing is very well known and very well celebrated amongst British writers and screenplay writers as well. So, I mean, you can definitely tell, like, it feels something aligned with Love Actually or Bridget Jones, in which they kind of have, like, romance and a bit of wit in there as well as a nice atmosphere where we do get to go to multiple places. And we can be able to have the world open up, which I think it's absolutely perfect. I think he was the right man to be cast to write this movie. Anyway, so continuing on with the story. So over time, Mr. Hoppy has been delivering the turtles, switching the tortoises to, Mrs. Silver without her knowing. And then at the point in which we have one more tortoise, named Spartacus, who's like the largest of them all, and he placed it down as his last tortoise. And then we have, Mrs. Silver saying, "Oh, I'm so thankful that, you told me about this. And, I want to be able to thank you. I don't know how." And then he decides he was going to invite her for dinner. But then Mr. Pringle said, "Hey, Mr. Hoppy, remember you promised that you were going to invite me over for dinner." And then he invites Mrs. Silver along for dinner. So then we have this funny situation in which his house is still surrounded by hundreds of tortoises, and they're like all in his kitchen, and he's supposed to serve them dinner. And then you have this whole situation with, like, Mrs. Silver is like really infatuated with Mr. Hoppy, with his garden and with the way he takes care of his house and his backstory about him being an American, and then him coming into the country when he was like a little boy and knowing about everything. There's a lot of like interesting moments that happen in this movie. Everything from wanting to help Mrs. Silver with donating some money to her charity, and it turned out to be like £1 an hour, and he ended up paying like over £300 when they started dancing for over 4 hours. Like, that was hilarious. Like, when we saw that, it was like, oh man, he not only was he spending so much money on the tortoises and the amount of food that he had to feed the tortoises, and we saw throughout the course of the movie that he had a box that he had been saving up so that he can go on a fishing trip. And then he constantly like put tape over it saying, I'm going to save it for a fishing rod. I'm going to save it for, a trip over to Canada. I'm going to save it over for a trip to Scotland. And then eventually he just put down bait.
Mm-hmm. So it gives you more sympathy for Mr. Hoppy in this because you're really rooting for him at that point because he's given up so much. He's given up his house to the tortoises. He's pretty much taken all the money out of his box, all his savings. Pretty much at this point, so it's you also he's coming up with all these creative ways to try and get the attention of Mrs. Silverman. So you really are in the cusp of it, really rooting for this guy.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So throughout the course of the movie, so after the dinner, Mr. Hoppy and Mrs. Silver become really, really infatuated with each other. And then it was at the point in which, he decides to, ask her maybe to meet up with her. And then finally, when she said, that would be great. I want you to see Alfie to see how much he's grown over the past month. And then toward one of the scenes, we actually do get to see the real Alfie walking out of the door and heading towards where Mrs. Silver was. And then just when Mr. Hoppy was just literally asking her right out there, it's will you marry me? And then she's shocked. It's I'm sorry, what did you say, Mr. Hoppy? It's you heard me. Will you marry me? Because I've loved you from the moment that I saw you, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. And just before she was able to give an answer, Mr. Pringle comes along and says, I believe that I have your tortoise, Mrs. Silver.
Yeah.
And then she's like,
well,
no, that can't be.
I mean, before we get into that, I mean, that's the first liberation from the book because
yes.
In the original book, when he actually asked the question, she did say yes right off the get-go, which is a bit unrealistic. But I guess if I guess she's just happy-go-lucky, I guess, in regards to her ways of love. But, and so obviously we get the variation where Mr. Pringle gets involved and pretty much dashes pretty much gives up the game at this point and says, it exposes the whole facade that this whole thing was just, a ruse to try and, get them together. And which gives us our bit where it's kind of maybe they're not going to get together and they're all going to be sad and they're all going to be thinking about what happened and things like that. It's it plays out to the ending of Mrs. Doubtfire, which is a movie we're going to be talking about very soon, I believe.
Yes, we are.
And so it kind of plays out they're not going to get back together in the end and things like that, and but then something else will come of it. And I was a bit worried at that point because they're they're taking quite a lot of liberties from the book. I mean, is this going to be a bit where it's kind of they're going to go with the whole they're just going to be friends or something like that? But no, she does eventually come around and say, yeah, I'm going to marry you. So it's
she said that for two reasons. Number one, with her date with Mr. Pringle, she absolutely hated it because he was constantly talking about himself and he was actually sneaking food from her plate. So
I'm really surprised you didn't get James Bond to kill him. But I'm sorry, people. Judi Dench is always going to be the person who orders Bond around to kill people. I mean, that's just the way that's. I see Judi Dench, and I'm sorry if I'm typecasting her, which I shouldn't really do with actors and actresses, really, because they're very talented. But in regards to Judy's performance in this, you wouldn't have told that she'd played, kind of colder characters, in a previous performance.
Typecast as yeah, she's always been typecast as playing the cold, stern character. She's either in royalty, she's played Queen Elizabeth and Queen Victoria multiple times, and she was always really stern and she never smiles. But in this, it's the complete opposite. She is so happy-go-lucky. She's enthusiastic. She's optimistic. She's always smiling.
Do you know what's funny? When she's on British TV, every time she swears, people start complaining. Because they just find it the fact that her swearing on television is just unacceptable in some way.
Why?
I have no idea. But apparently that's what they said when Judi Dench apparently swears on television. Apparently people start complaining.
Well, okay then. Sure.
It's some kind of weird quirk. It's something about her mannerisms. I don't know, but I'm pretty sure we'll find out in some crazy way why that is. But yeah. But here's the thing about this: you can't fault Judi Dench's performance. I don't know. What do you think of the twist that she herself was trying to get the affections of Mr. Hoppy?
I hadn't even expected it. Like, throughout this entire time, she has been trying to get attention from Mr. Hoppy. So all this time that she's been in the elevator, where it just so happened to be a coincidence that she was there when Mr. Hoppy would come in. No, she was planning on this the entire time. Every time that she saw Mr. Hoppy walking from outside, she always prepped herself to get herself ready so that she could meet up with him, because she also fell in love with him. So, she was waiting for Mr. Hoppy to say, I love you. But since Mr. Hoppy is so shy, Mrs. Silver just assumed that, maybe she just is just going to accept Mr. Hoppy as just a friend. But no, I mean, they just loved each other, and they never had the strength and the courage to say that to each other.
Mm-hmm. So, I'll tell you what, I love the ending of this movie. Don't you?
Yeah.
Yeah, like
it's so good. Like we didn't even mention the soundtrack. Now the soundtrack is mostly done by Louis Armstrong, which I think fits so perfectly, because I mean, Louis Armstrong's music, with his classic jazz and his classic trumpets playing with Mr. Hoppy obviously being an American, and him being old fashioned. So I can tell that it was really intentional. I mean, it's fit the scenes so well every time that the music is playing. And then with the ending, we have with finding out who the narrator was, and the narrator just so happened to have been a neighbor who lived really close to Mr. Hoppy and Mrs. Silver. And, throughout the course of the movie, we saw a little boy and his mother, and the little boy was telling, his mom's like, oh, Mom, there's this man who's trying to climb down the window. And she's like, oh, Philip, stop with your lying. And then, we even mentioned it when we saw the movie. It's like, that little boy looks like Luke. And I guess it's not too much a surprise. Like, a boy with like the short hair and the glasses. Yeah, very similar to like Luke or Sophie. So, Roald Dahl. And then it turns out that the narrator and, his daughter, they with the boy and his mom, I mean, they were a family. So it again, it goes into the connection that they actually knew each other. Like it all takes place in that one, apartment complex where they were all acquainted with each other, and that's how they knew the story. And the story was almost about to end there, because that was as far as they know. That that's Mrs. Silver no longer wanted to meet up with Mr. Hoppy, and then the daughter's like, but Daddy, what's going to happen to them? It's like, I don't know, dear. I just don't know. And, we saw Mr. Hoppy packing up his things, and he's just about to leave, and, he's about to move away somewhere, and he actually gives one of his plants over to Mrs. Silver, and then Mrs. Silver comes upstairs and gives him the plant back because, she didn't want anything to do with him anymore because he lied. And so that's when the confession came in about, like, she loved him all this time, and then eventually they got married, and they were happy together, and it's just so sweet and just so romantic, and the ending is just amazing.
Yeah, and I just like. I mean, here's the thing about this: like, how it's pretty good that the narrator actually has a explanation for the reason why he has this story. Because how many times have we seen movies where narrators just kind of like go on their own tangent and like are so distant from basically what's going on, and you just kind of sitting there like, how does he know all of this?
Exactly, yeah. And usually it will be like, oh, I was the neighbor, or it was me the entire time, or something like that. Or most of the times the narrator would have absolutely nothing to do with the story. So yeah, in this case, it's actually really clever and really smart, which this is why I said earlier that out of all the Roald Dahl adaptations that we've seen, this is the best implication of the narrator that we've seen so far.
Mm-hmm. So I think we pretty much got to the end of the movie.
Yeah, so final thoughts.
One of the better Roald Dahl movies, I think we can definitely say. Not boring like a Ted Turner movie, and not massively over the top like a Johnny Depp movie, which I think we can all agree. I think out of all the movies I think that we've watched that encapsulate a Roald Dahl tale, I think we'd never say Esio Trot's one of those movies that does it right.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's such a shame that for us Americans, we cannot get a hold of this movie. Very similar to like Danny the Champion of the World. It's very, very hard to come by this movie. I tried my very best to look for it, but unfortunately, they're
And
only
then I just
available on.
Googled it and just found it.
Yeah, you Googled it and then you found it on YouTube for like a few dollars. And,
Yeah.
the DVD is out, but it's region 2, which means I can't watch it. So yeah, it's very
Well,
difficult.
you can change the region on your. Oh wait, you've not got a DVD drive in your laptop, have you? I just realised.
No, I don't.
Oh dear. Yeah, basically you have to get yourself an external DVD drive and then change. Then you use your computer to change the region on it, and then you can obviously watch region 2 DVDs after that. So
Yeah.
yeah, but
So, yeah,
I mean, here's the thing about this. Like, I mean, BritBox is becoming a thing in America, so sooner or later it will turn up. I think.
Yeah.
Like I have since the fact that you and I have been talking about it, and the fact that a lot of other people like this movie as well. The fact that Judi Dench and the fact that Dustin Hoffman's in this movie, this won't stay a secret for a very long. I don't think. Eventually, he's going to turn up.
I hope so. I mean, even though that I know that it's going to be a little bit harder because, as you know, the American distribution was the Weinstein Company, and we know about all the controversies with that. So unless they can get another,
can find somebody, they'll find somebody else.
I'm sure they will. But in the meanwhile, it's going to be pretty obscure for Americans for quite a while. So unless you have like a VPN account in which you can be able to like watch various sites that are European, then I would suggest that you get on YouTube where you can buy it for a few dollars. Or you can buy the DVD, which is on Region 2. And if you do have a DVD drive on your laptop that can be able to switch over to Region 2, then yeah, I would suggest you get the DVD.
Well, not only is this on YouTube, apparently it's also on Google Play and it's also on Amazon Prime Video as well.
Yeah. So for those in the UK and around Europe, then you have the opportunity to go watch this. But it'll be a little bit difficult for us Americans, unless, of course, you do have a VPN account. So so I think that for my final thoughts, this is actually one of the better Roald Dahl adaptations that we've seen. I still think it's the most underrated. It has a great cast. The music's wonderful. The setting is great. They were able to change some things around the story of Roald Dahl, especially with the ending. But unlike The Witches, it actually makes sense because if you remember from the original ending of Esio Trot, in which Mrs. Silver never knew that Mr. Hoppy was lying to her, and he got married, being completely oblivious to the fact that the tortoise that she has is not Alfie, and then Alfie ended up living with another family around a garden, where eventually 20 years later he grew into the size that Spartacus became. So the change makes sense, and it keeps the spirit of the book. So if you can watch it, then please do.
You know what? I've actually been looking through this. You know the 44th International Emmy Awards? You know Dustin Hoffman won an Emmy for that.
Oh, really? He did?
Yeah, and Judi Dench got nominated. It didn't win.
Well, at least there was some recognition with this movie in the Emmys. But again, for those who are interested in checking it out, I recommend that you do.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so that is it for this episode of the Roald Dahl Retrospective. We're going to switch over to another TV movie from the BBC. Well, more specifically, it is a two-parter. So tune in next time as we're going to be going into Revolting Rhymes.
Until then, take care, everybody.
See you later.